Shalom, and I'm the president of the Bahamian American Cultural Society. I'd like to welcome you to the second genealogical conference that we are having. The first one was held a few years ago, but we constantly see the need to have another one. And I'm happy that you all are here, and I want to welcome you all. We have three presenters here. All three of them are here. We have first Gloria Lucas Ramsey, and she's the author of her wonderful book here, Slave Records of Edgefield County, South Carolina. Okay, anyone here from South Carolina other than the Ramseys? Okay, so we all are descendants from slaves, so I'm going to find this book very interesting. And we also have copies of this available for sale. Okay, so we're going to start with Gloria Ramsey. I think you've seen her bio. Gloria, I said, she's the author of The Slaves of Edgefield County, South Carolina. And she is a New Yorker. She said for 2 weeks her parents lived here in New York. And for 2 weeks they decided that they want a Jersey kid, so they went to Jersey, and that's where she was born. But I think Gloria is a New Yorker. I haven't spent only 2 weeks in New Jersey. We're going to call her a New Yorker. So we're going to be having our first speaker, a New Yorker. Okay, and of course, Gloria was also educated at Hofstra University here in New York City. And for 30 years, she was the Board of Education teacher before she retired. And she saw something interesting on the wall that where she was counted, and she didn't know that she was counted in statistics, that in 1955 she was designated a teacher. So that was interesting for Gloria to come. So she's going back with a whole wealth of information by reading the board there. Okay, so I'm going to, as a matter of fact, let me say that this year, April, Gloria received an award for her book from the Federation of South Carolina Logical Historical Society. And I was very happy to hear when she told me that she received that award for this fabulous work she did. So without any delay, I'm going to ask Gloria to come and give us her experience and her wealth of information. She is a genealogist by heart.
Okay. I'm so excited to be here at the Schomburg because I've actually been a supporter of the Schomburg for years while I was here, and continued my support when I moved to Georgia, but I couldn't go to any of the events because I was too far away. So I get the bulletin from the Schomburg all the time. Now, I lived in New York almost all of my life, except for those 2 weeks, and briefly in New Jersey much later. And I relocated to Georgia in 1996. I had already retired, dabbled in other things, and found out that I didn't like the other things, didn't want to teach anymore. So I started researching my family. I always considered myself a Georgia peach. My mother was born in Georgia. My father was born in Georgia. I had documented at least 4 of my grandparents, knew where they were buried, all in Georgia. So imagine my surprise when I started researching. Oh, I'm going to read this. This is one of my philosophies. An ancestor never dies until there's no one left to call their name. And I call my ancestors' names all the time. This picture, during my childhood, was up all the time. I saw it all the time, didn't worry about it. I was too busy playing in New York. You know, we played outside all day long. We didn't go in till evening. But this picture was always there, and as I grew up, I got curious about it. This is my mother as a child with her grandmother who raised her in, of course, Georgia, right? So I wanted to find out more about her grandmother, and that's where I started. And I found out that her father was born in South Carolina. That can't be. My mother didn't know that. My mother knew nothing of any South Carolina residents. She considered herself a Georgia peach. Well, you know, getting beyond the 1870 census barrier is very difficult for most Afro-Americans because they were not included in the census unless they were free. There were many free people of color. And you don't assume that your ancestors were slaves necessarily. You can look for them earlier than 1870. You may find them. They may not have been slaves, but many of us descend from slaves. I'm one of them. Now, Edgefield, South Carolina is just across the river, the Savannah River. And during the time of slavery, they just kept adding more and more and more. They loved having them work for them for nothing. I mean, except for the clothes they put on the back and the little food that they got in the shelter. By 1860, there were triple the number of slaves than white people. Now, of course, there were a lot of people very uncomfortable with that situation, as you might imagine, because everywhere they looked, there were slaves. About 40%, I think that's a little exaggeration. I didn't write this part. About 40% of the household heads owned slaves, but you'll find many people in the census who owned no slaves at all. They were just poor farmers. The majority of those who did own slaves ambitiously sought, who didn't own them wanted to own them, but they couldn't afford it because slaves were probably the most expensive commodity they would have, more expensive than land. James Henry Hammond was a huge slave owner. I've been to one of his plantations, beautiful place, and saw how he lived and how his slaves lived. It's quite a contrast, I would say. Very big contrast. They had frequent sales of slaves. All right, this is one of the places. They don't name them. They'll just give the ages sometimes, that they're hardy, that they have these skills or that skills. They had ads in the paper all the time. Now, one of the things that I used in my research to look for the slaves were things like this. This is a copy of an inventory of a person's when they died, what they owned. Now, if you notice, these happen to be my ancestors, all right? I put them up there because I knew where this was. Big Jenkins was my fourth great-grandfather. Sylvie was his wife. I'm double lucky because they not only named them, but they named their relationship, which is very important to me. Big Jenkins was the husband of Sylvie. Down further, Charlotte and Sylvie, those were their grandchildren. All right, I only know that because I've done the research. Elsie was their daughter. She was my great-great-grandfather's mother. And that was one of her children. But you get a little hint here because Peter happened to be Elsie's husband's name. And she named one of her children after her husband. Now, you may not see anything that says Elsie and Peter, husband and wife. You may not see that, but you can imply it because you see that the mother is naming one of her children after him. Here's an instance, Jenkins and Big Jenkins. It's a boy, so you can imply that he's related to that first Jenkins up there. Now it gives prices, what their value was, when they were born, when this was taken. This is 1826. A boy was about $150. By 1864, or can you imagine, they cost thousands. Couple of thousand, 3,000 by 1864, before the Civil War ended. They had great value. But in 1820, now it moved. Oh, I don't know why. These are some of the slaves of Henry Hammond. And now I have not seen this. This is, you have to be very lucky to get something like this that tells you what they do for a living. This is Leroy Hammond's slaves, and it names what they do: boat hand, washerwoman, shoemaker. Sometimes there were those who had trades like brick masons. They were highly, or blacksmiths. They were highly valued.
What are the dollar amounts?
I'm sorry?
The dollar amounts on the side.
Let me go back.
It cost?
Say it again.
See the dollar amounts on the side, what does that refer to?
Where do you, say it again?
How much, the money, there's a list of,
That's how much their value was in 1790.
okay.
You know, as you go back in the early years, as the years progressed, their value increased and increased. And just before the end of the war, very expensive. Now, when I did this research, most of the, I have to call it hypocritical. Most of the records just referred to the slaves as Negroes. Very rarely did they use the word slave. They didn't use it. And certainly they didn't use it in their church records. They would say, servant of Leroy Hammond. They wouldn't say slave. They were hypocrites. They knew slavery was wrong. So in their Bible records, their church records, they didn't use the word. Now, it's very difficult. In my book, I used whatever term they used to describe the slave. I used that. I didn't change the spelling of their names or how they referred to them. In most cases, they just said girl. Once in a while, you would see the word wench, and people would say, well, that means somebody between the ages so-and-so, but you really couldn't tell from that. And certainly with the males, if they called them a boy, did not mean they were a boy. They would have boy, and the man would be 65 years old. So you cannot really go tell how old they were from that. And very rarely did I find ages given. It would be nice if you would know, then you could get a handle on when they were born, but usually you did not get ages. Prime male hand was very, very important because they did the hard work. Prime women were good breeders, and they bred them. They would breed them with another hardy male, and they get more slaves, more value. Other factors that contribute to their sale price was if they were young and a skill. The very old, the sick, or the debilitated, some of them they call superannuated. I had an ancestor, I can't tell you, maybe my fourth great-grandmother, and she was 95. And, you know, sometimes you get a little pissed off when you read some of the remarks, right? And this one said, cannot work. Well, I said, you right, she can't work at 95. Yeah, but yes. But that's what they wrote next to her name in the census, cannot work. I said, okay. What greater thing is there for humans than to feel that they're connected for life, to be with others in silent, unspeakable memories that pass through the ages? Just as an aside, I found my great-grandmother's father, Hamptonroni, and I have a little luck when it comes to research. I mean, I dig. I look at everything. But I got lucky, and I actually got a proof of when he was born recorded in the slave owners' records, his actual birthday. And it was April the 5th, 1830. And that year, I celebrated his birthday, Hamptonroni. And I'll never forget his name because he was born a slave in 1830. And in 1865, when the war ended, he hightailed it out of Edgefield as fast as his feet could carry him and went to Georgia. That's why my people came from Georgia. And he registered to vote. Now, I have no record that he did vote, but he did register. I do have a copy of that, where he registered to vote for the first time, having been born a slave on a plantation. Isn't that amazing? Now, this book, I didn't start out to write a book. These records are really quite extraordinary in Edgefield, that county, that the slaves were their most valuable asset, so they kept very good records, and they still survive. You can go and see the original record, the slave list, what they sold for, who they went to. Now, when I saw that these records were available and knew what I was able to do with them myself, I said, other people need these. They cannot do what I'm doing. I'm retired. I can go when I want to go. I can stay as long as I want to. And so I started what I thought was going to be 6 months, a year, 6 years it took to finish it. But it is available, and it's really quite remarkable to see all of these slave names. And sometimes you can see them start out as a boy and as a man later on, with different families. To me, it was a labor of love. I'd like you to have a look at it when you get a chance. And if you're interested, anybody here has some Edgefield ancestors, it'd be a good thing to buy. All right? Do you have any questions? No questions. Okay. Actually, the generations that went before us continue to affect who we are today. I think that Hampton, as my ancestor, inspired me to do this for other people so they don't have to go run into the courthouse. They can look in the book and find them. The way to our past may have a lot of difficulty, but we should never give up. Knowing where we came from strengthens us and gives us the courage and dignity necessary to advance our lives. Good luck to you in your search.
In talking to friends in Nassau about the genealogical conference coming up, I mentioned to them about Edgefield, that we're in Georgia, the South, and she said that most of the slaves that came to Bahamas came from this area, from the South. So it was good to know that, to show that correlation between Edgefield in the South as well as the Bahamas. Of course, my ancestors came from the Georgia area. They were British and Loyalists, and they fought in the Revolutionary Army. And my great-grandfather, who was a blacksmith and furrier, he fought for the Americans, before the British came into the United States. And when the British came in, he absconded from the British to the Americans, from the Americans to the British. And he was in prison for treason, he and his brother. So I said, there goes my membership to the Daughters of the Revolution. Yeah. So researching my ancestors, and I hope that you would also begin that search. It's very enriching. No one can tell me I cannot be among the rich and the famous, because I know exactly who I am through my research. So you become very powerful in yourself, and you begin to know and respect who you are and where you're from. You're from good soul, good stuff. So, I hope that you would take on that challenge. And let's give Gloria another round of applause. The next person that we're going to present is Grace Turner. Grace and I go way back. She has moved to Virginia to pursue a doctorate degree in anthropology, and she's now a adjunct professor at William and Mary. And Grace has had quite a tremendous experience working in the Bahamas through with all the various archival divisions. And I'm sure that folks are waiting for Grace to come back so that she can share the wealth of information that she brought with her to Virginia, and the information that she's going to be taking back. So Grace is going to be of tremendous value to the Bahamian community when she returns, and I hope she would not hesitate to return and not let folks encourage her to stay on and earn big bucks.
Gloria's presentation was quite specific because she was researching her family. Mine is going to be more general, and because it's more general, I figured I would weave in the history of the Bahamas to explain why some of these connections are what they are being. Now, let me hook up my mouth so that I can get, Gloria and I were chatting this morning while we were waiting around. My father's family, the Turners in the Bahamas, are generally from Cat Island, and this is a beach area just outside of Arthurstown in Cat Island. So, yeah, it was gorgeous. I couldn't resist. Screensaver, let me bring up. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, so once I discovered Google Maps, I don't use those paper maps anymore. I'm using this map to show the relationship between the Bahamas and the United States because there's constant movement back and forth, constant movement of people back and forth. And ever since Europeans came in this time, the Bahamas played a pivotal role because here in its location, it's at a nexus that joins any currents, any movement between North America and the Caribbean. So it's at a critical point. And that's going to come up at a later point in the presentation. But I wanted you to see the relationship because for Gloria's presentation, she discovered in her family's genealogy that her family didn't start in Georgia. They went back to the Carolinas. Well, for the Bahamas, in looking at connections between the Bahamas and the United States, it starts with the Revolutionary War. For those people who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown and didn't want to become a U.S. citizen, they had to leave those territories. And for the Bahamas, about two-thirds, at least two-thirds of the Loyalists who ended up relocating to the Bahamas came from Georgia and both of the Carolinas. What they did, because the largest British territory nearby was Canada. They could have gone to Bermuda, but that was too small. So they went originally to Florida. At this time, Britain, they were the superpower at the time. They were at war with, it seemed like, everybody. And when the Revolutionary War ended in the early 1780s, the British also ended their war with Spain, so they had to give Florida back. All British people who were in Florida, if they didn't want to learn Spanish, had to leave again. So that's why these Loyalists who had been in Georgia and the Carolinas and had gone to what they thought was the nearest British territory in Florida, when Florida reverted to Spain, then the Bahamas became a prime location. Very few went to Jamaica because that was just too far. There were all these other areas. That movement of Loyalist planters coming into the Bahamas serves as a huge watershed in Bahamian history because it not only boosted the population, it changed the demographics of the population. Up until that point, the Bahamas only had a population of about 3,000 to 6,000 people. It was definitely less than 10,000 people. They all lived on New Providence, which we generically call Nassau. New Providence, Eleuthera, no, this is Eleuthera back here. Eleuthera, that was the island where English settlers first came in, and some of the little keys, the tiny islands off Eleuthera. So most of the Bahama archipelago at this time was not populated. With Loyalists coming in, about 6,000 Loyalists came in, so that's like white people. Because these were wealthy, large landowners in a slaveholding society, it meant they brought in more than 10,000 blacks with them. Not all of those blacks were slaves. Some of those blacks, as Beryl mentioned, her ancestor got to British lines. That's how the British were undermining the Americans. The word went out, and you just had to have the word go out, that any enslaved person who made it behind British lines were to be free. That was how they would take away the labor force. Some of those were tricked and resold into slavery in Florida.
Yeah, I'm missing some. Who were the original people there that were less than 3,000 to 6,000? They weren't blacks and they weren't white. What were they?
Oh, I forgot. Let me back up. The couple thousand people who were already in the Bahamas, up to that point, were half black, about half of that population were black, either slave or free. The other half were white. But the Bahamas is one of only about 5 or 6 British Caribbean territories that was never heavily dependent on plantation agriculture. They lived from the sea, more or less. And so for the population there were whites there. They were not large landowners. There were plantations, but they weren't the focus of the economy. They lived off fishing, turtling, wrecking, gathering hardwoods, collecting salt. For loyalists coming in who were large landowners, who were professionals like lawyers, they thought these were some good for nothing, no good bombs, who had a good line on why they just sailed around all day in boats. So the loyalists called these local whites, they called them conks. It has a slightly negative connotation. White Bahamians today are still called that. Don't listen to them when they say that's a light-skinned black. That's white people. Yeah, there's a question back. Yeah, the indigenous people for the Bahamas were Lucayan Tainos. These were the people who met Columbus. Within 30 years after 1492, by 1520, there were no more Lucayans living in the Bahamas. Why? Because the Bahamas are just off the coast of the two largest islands in the Caribbean. When the Spanish came in the 1490s, the Taino lived in the Caribbean from the Virgin Islands further west, from the Windward and Leeward Islands that are these islands going south. The Caribs lived there. The Caribs are an Arawakan-speaking people. It's a historical mistake to say that the Caribs and the Arawaks were fighting against each other. The Caribs were aggressive, but they interacted and traded. But the most highly organized groups of the Taino in the Caribbean were focused on what the island they called Haiti and Cuba. Those are their original Taino names. Because of that, because they had such highly organized, centralized populations, because they had gold, the Spanish focused on those islands. And an area like the Bahamas, the Lucayos Islands, they only went back there to get people. And all of the debate and the discussions about which island is the original San Salvador, that came up when the English people came in, because English people got their information like 5th or 10th hand. The Spanish never had any debate or any discussion over which island was Guanahani, where Columbus landed and renamed it San Salvador. That came up when the English people came in, because the English quiet titled the Bahamas. In British law, quiet titling means you legally stake a claim to someone's land, and when they come back, your name has been imposed on it. The British did that to claim the Bahamas. Because the Lucayans had been taken away, they were excellent divers, and there was a pearl fisheries in the some tiny little islands off the Venezuelan coast. Within a couple of years, as Gloria had mentioned, with African slaves, for Lucayans, when they were originally being captured as slaves, originally their price was a couple pieces of gold. When it was realized how valuable they were as pearl divers, their price went up to several hundred pieces of gold. And they were free diving, but they were constantly diving over and over. And so a Lucayan diver wouldn't survive very long, because it's because the encounter with these native peoples, they weren't used to this constant go work schedule. Lucayans were always trying to run away. They didn't have the same kinds of immunities as people from the other part of the world, and that includes Europe, Africa, and Asia. The immunities to their diseases the populations in this part of the world, their bodies hadn't had a time to build up the same kinds of resistance, and so measles could knock them out. Mumps, those kinds of simple diseases in the old world was deadly in the new world. And so for these kinds of things, the Lucayans are documented as the earliest casualty in that encounter. So, and the Spanish, they are controlling the largest islands. By 1519, they encountered the Aztec Empire in Central America, they ran into the three largest empires in this part of the world. The Aztec capital was bigger than any capital in Europe at the time. So they're not looking at any place like the Bahamas to settle. The Bahamas was depopulated for more than 100 years before English people started coming in the 1640s. The earliest English settlement came into the Bahamas. They came from Bermuda in the 1640s. And they came into Eleuthera. They got in a shipwreck just off the coast, and it's documented. They did settle there. And in the Bahamas, it has become pretty much a private cultural joke in the Bahamas to make jokes about white Bahamians, the Conky Joes, how closely they intermarry. Well, the archaeology of the cave site, the Preacher's Cave, where this group first landed, found some burials. One of those burials was a child. The child looked from the size to be about a year old, but the developmental stage of the bones and the teeth indicated that this child was at least a year or two older. But DNA analysis showed that this child had a genetic defect that restricts growth. It causes a kind of dwarfism. Dwarfism is still prevalent, especially in the Spanish Wells community, the descendant community from that. The reason why you're not supposed to marry a close relative, if you have a genetic defect like that, you hold it within your gene pool and it becomes more pronounced than if you constantly get fresh blood to dilute it. And so that archaeology provided evidence that this original group coming in had that genetic defect, and because of the racial aspects of the society, and they remained such a tight, close group, even after the Loyalists came, because I'm going to go into more details about that, a defect like that became more prominent in the society. So the 300 years later, it's still noticeable in that population. But tracking forward to the Loyalists coming in, even though they're white, they were from a very different background. They're considering themselves British because they're being loyal to the British Crown. So they're loyalists, but they were looking down. They were being very elitist and snobbish to the local whites. That has caused some problems and issues that, unless you think of it that way, you still don't realize it today. Being loyalists, in terms of religion, they would either be Anglican or Episcopalian, as Americans say, Anglican or Presbyterian. Most of them were Anglican. Because of all of the conflict with the local whites, they are any white Bahamian you find today who is an Anglican, I could guarantee you, they were not, either their ancestry isn't loyalist or they ain't as white as they trying to see. Because with the Loyalists, coming in with the Loyalists were a number of free blacks. And with those free blacks in the late 1700s, some of the other things that were going on was the Great Awakening. It was a spiritual movement. That spiritual movement saw the growth of the Baptist Church. The Baptist Church would be the equivalent of like the charismatics, the ones who are like the fundamentalists today. The Baptist Church was like that today. They attracted a lot of blacks, whether they were slave or free, because the Baptists didn't follow the usual tradition of being very quiet and going through a song mass. The Baptists, they would shout, they would holler, they would dance around. That was very attractive to people with an African cultural heritage. But the Methodists was a breakaway group from the Anglican Church. The Methodists coming into the Bahamas, the first missionary coming in was a mixed race black, a free colored. There was some white converts. Those white converts were predominantly the local whites, the Loyalists. The friction showed up particularly in their religious community, because that's your social community apart from your family you're going to relate to. So even today on Eleuthera, Loyalists didn't go to Eleuthera. They were so not welcome there. The heart of the Methodist Church even today in the Bahamas is in Eleuthera. Loyalists moved out to other islands. The demographics of the population changed from the 1780s up to now. Today, the demographics of the Bahamian population is between 80 and 90% predominantly of African descent. The other 10%, they like to say, they predominantly European descent. It's in anywhere in the Caribbean, the treatment of racial identity is very different than in the United States that had the one-drop rule. Elsewhere in the Caribbean and in Latin America, it's a sliding scale. Certain things can come in. Color does play a big part of it. Education, your social connections. Tex and I were talking. I mentioned to Tex that in a white cemetery in Nassau, the cemetery dates from the 1700s, there is a man that could only have been a free African. His name was Monday Ranger. His place of birth was Lagos, Nigeria, but he is buried in the white cemetery and not the black cemetery. Why? Because in life, he definitely had some big social connections. So he was treated as a white man, not as a black man. Never in America. But in the Bahamas, the Loyalists coming in brought in this whole big shift in the population demographics, and if they talk bad about the white people, you could imagine the black people. They didn't trust no non-white person who was saying they was free up in here. It was like, all of you know this lie. You run away. I go search. I bet I could find who you ran away from. And there was a group of young Loyalist young men. These were the sons of the older planters who were literally, it sounds like they were going and kicking down people's doors. And the laws were at that time were the same as in the United States. The word of a black person in court could not counteract the word of a white person, especially if it was a major case. If the person who was being found guilty, if that person was going to be executed, the word of a black person alone could not convict them. A white person had to do that. And if you were black, you needed a white person to verify what all of them black people were saying about you. So there were a number of free blacks living in Nassau who were re-enslaved because they couldn't find a white person to vouch for them. There were some white people who would step up, but the Loyalists caused this kind of friction and upset, so nobody was really loving them. And because they were coming from Georgia and the Carolinas, the Bahamas is the exception. Anywhere in the Caribbean where our plantation period wasn't sugar plantations, it was cotton. And you know how in Bahamian they say God don't like ugly? Yeah, well, he rarely paid them back. They came in and established these plantations, cotton plantations, throughout the Bahamas. Islands that hadn't been occupied since the Lucayans had left them now had plantations. And the major plantation islands were in the central Bahamas: Cat Island, San Salvador, Auckland's Crooked Island, Long Island, Exumas. Those were the major plantation islands. That would be these islands here in the central Bahamas. And by 1800, planters were realizing, hey, you know, we ain't getting as much profit from our crops as when we were back in Georgia and the Carolinas. The colonial government sent out a questionnaire to 25 of the bigger, more wealthier planters to do a survey to try and understand what was happening, what caused these plantations to fail so miserably and so soon. And one of the key things they said, just about all of these planters, because their land grants, because Tex would deal with this kind of information, these land grants, they would be given tracts of like 1,000 acres. One planter could have plantations on 3 or 4 different islands. So these planters, their total land ownership throughout the Bahamas could be several thousand acres. What they said, they had come from areas like Georgia and the Carolinas, that's wide open plain that has very deep soil. The Bahamas is, the northern part is subtropical, the southern half is tropical. The soils are standard tropical soils. They seem to be very rich, but they're extremely fragile. If you clear off that vegetation too quickly, you open up the land to erosion quickly. And they admitted that they cleared too much land too soon. They didn't understand, they didn't realize that the Bahamas is open to hurricanes a lot more frequently than the eastern seaboard of the United States is. And with the exposed land, you having all these insects. They got a visit from that little insect, the boll weevil. But within 20 years, these plantations had already peaked. And most of them by 1800, by the first decade of the 1800s, most of those 6,000 loyalists had left the Bahamas. But that set the Bahamas up for a very different profile, pretty much a unique profile in the plantation history in the Caribbean, because some of them stayed on their plantations, and pretty much down to a man, because these were the men, pretty much down to a man. The ones who stayed on their plantations had an enslaved sweet patootie with them. They had children by one of their slaves. But unlike the U.S., what's more common in the Caribbean, those planters who had children by their slaves, most of them, not all, most of them, those children inherited that property. Some of the planters moved back to Nassau because Nassau was always the hub, the city, and they had a business manager dealing with their properties. Well, you needed someone on the property. There are several cases in the Bahamas where another enslaved person was the overseer on that. We have a documented case from San Salvador, and his name was Prince. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, that wasn't happening because the value of that land remained high. So they wasn't letting no slave, no black person was getting even close to thinking they was kind of if but owning that land. In the Bahamas, it was like, let them, all of y'all were nothing together, so y'all could stay. What that set up under British law, the landmark case is Lord John Roll. Lord Roll was an absentee landlord. He didn't even come. Children didn't come. He sent the business manager. The business manager get to Nassau and was like, hell no. Lord Roll owned 5 plantations on Great Exomer Island. And those slaves, by the 1820s, those slaves were living on their own. No white person was managing over them. No enslaved person was managing over them. And they got righteously indignant up in there when the message came from the business owner, because Lord Roll back in England was like, I need some more profits from my property. And the business manager sent the word that some of them, they were to be split up and relocated. Some were to go to Trinidad, some were to go elsewhere. Well, being black people and out in the sun, they were like, hell no. We got some peas. We just planted our corn and what? And ain't we here? We supposed to be free? No, they staged a rebellion, and to them, this is really how in history you really have to look at who is saying what. Where is this information coming up? The white people go and call it a rebellion. The black people's like, we will harvest our corn, we ain't moving no place, we fighting for our rights, and ain't we supposed to be free too? A group of the leaders got in a boat that they made and they used to use and went to Nassau because they had to go talk to this here governor about how this man carrying on with these people telling them. They were led by a slave named Pompey. And no, we don't spell it with the 2 Y's. It have the E-Y, that's us. So Pompey and those, when they landed, of course the other landowners, this is a threat to them. They arrested on them, put them in the jail and say they thieved the boat. And they was like, huh? That they were charged with rioting, rebellion, stealing, and everything bad to keep them in jail. Fortunately, the governor at the time was an abolitionist, Sir James Carmichael Smith, because the governor was like the governor was the Supreme Court for the case. The governor had a lot of legal training. And the governor realized, looking at it rationally, the governor realized that it really was a case of miscommunication, misunderstanding. The enslaved people weren't saying no, they weren't willing to work for Lord Rowe. They wanted to be given more time to harvest their crops. Yeah, some of them saying, yeah, we ain't going to Trinidad and Island. No, why we can't stay on Exuma? And so, because he was abolitionist, he heard their case more, and so he allowed them to go back. And this case was being negotiated in 1828. This is before emancipation. So they were allowed to go back to these plantations in Exuma. They were allowed to have Sundays off. They were allowed to have time to work on their own lands, because the cheap way was to allow slaves to work some land to provide crops for themselves. They were allowed to work on their own crops and plus work for Lord Rowe, and no, they weren't going to move. So it ended up being a victory for them. They stayed. By the 1890s, the descendants of those Rowe slaves were recognized as the rightful owners of that property. Why? I did a presentation and there was some dissents. They were like, Lord Rowe give you. It's like, Lord Rowe didn't give you all nothing. Lord Rowe, we gone and find him. Well, Lord Rowe didn't even leave that to y'all. His children didn't give that. They got that through squatters' rights. For squatters' rights in British law, for squatters' rights to claim that, you have to prove that you were actively using and occupying the land with the owner's permission or without, but you are there, the legitimate owner, the owner who owns it on paper, isn't making any effort to force you off. And if you can do that for 20 years or more, you claim squatters' rights. That was established in British law before they start bringing black people in here. So by the 1890s, in a landmark case, the descendants of the Rowe slaves were recognized as legitimate owners of that property. I figure that's fair and equal exchange for all them. That is a landmark case in the Bahamas. There are some other cases that continue to be contentious because, as I mentioned, in the Bahamas, since the Loyalists came in, and since then, it's been a predominantly African-descended population. There is an African landholding system that got into Bahamian, because this makes the Bahamas pretty exceptional for elsewhere in the Caribbean, because elsewhere in the Caribbean, plantation property remains valuable even today. And so it's rare for even the mulatto descendants to inherit that. But in the Bahamas, the property value crashed. Black people were controlling land, and even when they had the title papers, in the Bahamas it's called generation property. And on generation property, whether it's from your mother's side or your father's side, as long as you can prove that you are directly descended from the people who are the original claimants of this land, you have access to the land. That is not in English law. And so because of that, that whole contentious issue about generation property comes out of the historical background of the Loyalist plantations failing, the white landowners leaving and not bothering to send their children would be like, and so you find that the descendants of those slaves stayed on that land and was using it when the owners didn't. Sometimes they had the papers, but because they're African-descended people, they thought that they could treat the generation property equally with the paper-holding property. My family lost hundreds of acres like that. But that comes out of that background. Okay, so the period of the Loyalists is where you get this first jump. So now we fast forward. The British back in England, I mentioned with the Baptists coming up, and the Baptists were very active. And in religion, the moral issue about slavery comes up, and the Baptists were leading the charge on that. So from the 1790s, in England, there is a movement to end slavery. They finally backed it up to end just the slave trade. The British ended that slave trade in 1807, but that still didn't mean, just because you say something happened doesn't mean people are going to stop. So 1811, the Bahamas got the first group of liberated Africans. African captives who had been captured in Africa, put on a ship intended to be sold in a slave market, but the Royal Navy, because by the early 1800s, the Royal Navy was the most powerful navy. This was the superpower. And the Royal Navy, they had developed treaties and agreements with all of the European countries and the United States who participated in the slave trade to negotiate with them when the Royal Navy encounter a ship carrying your flag. Where is that ship to be landed? Which court is going to adjudicate that? There was one of those courts at Havana, and because Cuba was a big slaving market and the southern United States. So that meant that between 1807 and 1834, the Bahamas was, for any of those ships, the Bahamas was the major landing spot for those Africans.
Yeah. 2 minutes.